It was during the last week of November, in the year 1889, that I found myself once more drawn into one of those extraordinary cases which, though seemingly insignificant at their beginning, grew in complexity until they touched upon matters of the gravest consequence. A thick fog had descended upon London that evening. It pressed against the windows of our rooms at Baker Street like some living thing, swallowing the lamps of the street and reducing the familiar sounds of traffic to distant, muffled murmurs. I had been seated beside the fire, attempting to interest myself in a medical journal, while my friend Sherlock Holmes reclined upon the sofa with his long, thin fingers pressed together. For nearly 20 minutes he had not spoken. I had learned by experience that such silences were rarely meaningless. "You are wondering," said Holmes suddenly, without moving his eyes from the ceiling, "why I have placed the poker upon the left side of the grate." I looked at him in surprise. I confessed that I had not noticed it. "Precisely. Most people do not observe what is before them, Watson, they merely see it." He rose and crossed the room. "The poker was beside the fireplace when you entered. The ash upon its end indicates that it was used recently, yet the fire was not disturbed. Therefore it was not used upon the fire." "You mean—" "I mean nothing at present." He picked up the poker and examined its end beneath the gaslight. "Interesting." Before I could ask what he had discovered, 3 sharp knocks sounded upon the door below. Holmes glanced toward me. "Our visitor has arrived." A moment later Mrs. Hudson announced a gentleman. The man who entered was tall, perhaps 50 years of age, dressed in a heavy black traveling coat upon which the dampness of the fog still clung. His face was pale, narrow, and deeply lined. In his gloved hand he carried a silver-headed walking stick, but it was the expression in his eyes that caught my attention. He looked like a man who had seen something he could neither explain nor forget. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. Holmes inclined his head. "At your service." The stranger looked toward me. "Dr. Watson?" "Yes." He hesitated before closing the door behind him. "My name is Edward Harcourt." Holmes indicated the chair. "Please sit down, Mr. Harcourt." Our visitor remained standing. "I have come because a man is dead." Holmes showed no surprise. "Many men are dead, Mr. Harcourt. This man was murdered. That is more interesting. He was found this morning." "Where?" Harcourt swallowed. "In Blackwater Moor." The name meant little to me, though Holmes's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Blackwater Moor," he repeated. "Yes." "Northumberland?" "No, Surrey." Holmes turned toward the fire. "And why has this death brought you to me, rather than Scotland Yard?" "Because the police believe they know who did it." "And you do not?" "No, Mr. Holmes." There was a short silence. "Who do they suspect?" "A man named Samuel Vane." "On what grounds?" Harcourt removed one glove. "Because Vane was seen near the moor last night." "Because the dead man had quarreled with him 2 days ago." "And because Vane's boots were found to have the same clay upon them as the ground where the body was discovered." Holmes smiled faintly. "That is a remarkable collection of evidence." "You think so?" "I think it is remarkably convenient." The visitor stared at him. "What do you mean?" Holmes leaned forward. "Tell me everything from the beginning." Harcourt took a breath. "The dead man was Sir Reginald Wexford." The name was familiar to me. Sir Reginald was a wealthy landowner whose estate in Surrey was said to be considerable. I had encountered his name in the newspapers on several occasions, usually in connection with charitable donations or disputes concerning his extensive property. "He was 62 years old," Harcourt continued, "a widower. He lived at Wexford Hall with his daughter, Miss Eleanor Wexford, and 3 servants." "And you?" "I was his solicitor." "Go on." "Last night Sir Reginald left the house shortly after 9 o'clock. He told no one where he was going. At 7 this morning, one of the estate workers discovered his body on the western edge of Blackwater Moor. Cause of death? A blow to the head. With what weapon? None was found." Holmes nodded. "And the footprints?" Harcourt's face tightened. "There was only one clear trail leading toward the body. The police followed it backward and discovered that it came from the direction of the village." "Convenient indeed," murmured Holmes. "What?" "Nothing. Continue." "The footprints belong to a large boot. Samuel Vane wears such boots." "Who is Samuel Vane?" "A former gamekeeper." "Former? He was dismissed by Sir Reginald 3 months ago." "Why?" Harcourt looked uncomfortable. "They quarreled." "Over?" I do not know. Holmes raised an eyebrow. You are his solicitor and do not know. Sir Reginald was not a man who explained his private affairs. Yet you know that they quarrelled. Yes. And now Vane is suspected of murder. Yes. Where is he? Under arrest. Holmes stood. And Scotland Yard? Inspector Lestrade is handling the matter. At that, Holmes gave a quiet laugh. Then I fear, Mr. Harcourt, that the case may already have become considerably more complicated than you imagine. Harcourt stared at him. Can you help us? Holmes turned toward the window. Outside, the fog had thickened until the gas lamps appeared like pale moons suspended in darkness. That depends, he said, upon whether the dead man was killed on the moor. I confess that I stared at my friend. What possible difference can that make? Holmes picked up his coat. A very considerable one, Watson. But surely the body was found there. Found there, yes. He looked at Harcourt. You said the body was discovered at 7 this morning? Yes. And when was Sir Reginald last seen alive? At approximately 9 o'clock. Then there are 10 hours between those two events. Indeed. Holmes's eyes had taken on that peculiar brightness which I knew so well. And during those 10 hours, Mr. Harcourt, someone had ample opportunity to move a body. The solicitor's face went white. You think it was moved? I think nothing yet. He reached for his hat. I merely object to accepting conclusions before examining facts. As we descended the stairs, I caught sight of something lying upon the umbrella stand. It was a small object, almost hidden beneath my own walking cane. I picked it up, a fragment of dark green cloth. Holmes, I said, this is not mine. He examined it beneath the hall lamp. No, could it have come from our visitor's coat? Holmes turned the fragment over between his fingers. Perhaps. He handed it back to me. Keep it, Watson. Why? Because if it belongs to Mr. Harcourt, it tells us nothing. And if it does not, Holmes smiled, then it may tell us rather too much. We stepped into the fog. Neither of us noticed at first the narrow shadow standing across the street, but when Holmes paused beneath the lamp, the figure vanished into the mist. And it was not until many hours later, when we stood upon the bleak edge of Blackwater Moor, that I understood how significant that fleeting presence had been. For upon the wet ground beside the dead man's body there were footprints. One set belonged to Samuel Vane, another belonged to the murderer, and a third set, a set which no one had yet discovered, led away from the body toward the old ruined chapel at the heart of the moor. By the time Holmes and I reached Blackwater Moor, the morning had scarcely begun to distinguish itself from the night. A pale, colorless light hovered behind the clouds, while a cold mist rolled low across the heath and gathered in the hollows like smoke from some enormous subterranean fire. The road from the village had been difficult enough, but once we left the carriage behind, the ground became treacherous beneath our feet. Pools of black water lay concealed beneath the heather, and more than once my boots sank ankle-deep into the sodden earth. Holmes, however, appeared entirely unconcerned with the discomfort of our surroundings. He walked several paces ahead, his eyes fixed upon the ground, occasionally stopping to examine some broken stem or depression in the earth. At last he raised one hand. There, Watson. I followed his gaze and saw the body of Sir Reginald Wexford lying beneath a large elm tree. A constable stood nearby, while Inspector Lestrade was speaking with a man whom I recognized from the description as Samuel Vane. The former gamekeeper was broad-shouldered, dark-bearded, and perhaps 40 years of age. His clothes were muddy, his expression exhausted, and there was a deep cut upon one side of his forehead. When he saw Holmes, his eyes widened. "You are Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. "I am." "Then perhaps you can tell them I did not kill him." Lestrade turned sharply. "Vane, I have told you already, save your explanations for the magistrate." Holmes ignored the exchange and approached the body. Sir Reginald lay upon his back, his grey hair damp with mist, his right hand partly closed, and a dark stain visible upon the collar of his coat. There was no weapon nearby. Holmes knelt beside him without touching the body. He examined the man's boots first, then his trousers, then the sleeves of his coat. "Curious," he murmured. "What is curious?" I asked. "The mud." He pointed to Sir Reginald's left boot. "Look carefully, Watson. What do you see?" I saw nothing beyond the obvious. "It is wet." "Yes, but the mud upon the boot is pale brown, while the soil immediately beneath him is almost black." Lestrade gave a dismissive grunt. "The fellow walked here before he was killed." "Perhaps," said Holmes. "But if he walked here, why are there no corresponding impressions beneath the heel?" Lestrade frowned and looked down. Holmes was correct. The soil immediately around the body showed several footprints, but none matched the position of Sir Reginald's boots. "The body was moved," I said. Holmes gave me an approving glance. "Precisely." Lestrade folded his arms. "That proves nothing. Someone could have carried him after the murder, which is exactly what I have suggested." Holmes rose and examined the surrounding ground, but whoever carried him was not alone. "How do you know that?" I asked. Holmes pointed toward a patch of flattened heather. "There are impressions here. 2 men stood at this spot. One was wearing heavy boots, the other a narrower shoe. The heavier man bore most of the weight. He moved several yards toward the east. And here we have something even more interesting." There was a faint line running through the wet grass. At first I believed it to be nothing more than a trail made by an animal, but Holmes followed it carefully until it disappeared among a cluster of stones. "The body was dragged for part of the distance," he said, "then lifted." Lestrade's face had become serious. "Lifted by whom?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he turned toward the moor. "Watson, what do you notice about the fog?" "That it is thick, too thick in the low ground, but surprisingly thin upon the rise." He pointed toward a distant hill. "If a man wished to conceal his movements last night, where would he walk? Through the low ground." "Exactly, yet our unknown visitor did not. He began walking toward the hill. I followed, while Lestrade remained behind with the constables." After several minutes, Holmes stopped beside a narrow stretch of earth where the vegetation had been disturbed. "Here," I examined the ground and saw a series of footprints leading away from the scene. Unlike the broad impressions near Sir Reginald's body, these marks were small and sharply defined. "A woman's shoe?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "A narrow shoe, approximately a size 5, with a distinctive heel." He crouched and studied the next impression. "And the wearer was in a hurry." "How can you tell?" "The stride is longer than normal, and the left foot has slipped slightly twice. The person was either frightened or carrying something heavy." We followed the prints until they reached an old stone path almost hidden beneath the grass. Beyond it stood the ruined chapel. It was a miserable structure, little more than 4 walls and a roofless tower, abandoned for decades. Its broken windows were black against the grey morning. "That chapel," I said. "The footprints from last night led toward it." Holmes nodded. "Yes." "Then perhaps we have found our murderer." "Perhaps," he replied. "But you are forgetting the most important question." "Which is?" "Why would a murderer who had successfully concealed a body leave footprints leading directly to the very place in which he wished to hide?" I considered this, unless he wanted someone to find them. Holmes smiled. "Now you are thinking." We entered the chapel. The interior smelled of damp stone and decaying wood. A broken altar stood at the far end, and beneath it were several old wooden boxes covered in dust. Holmes examined the floor carefully. Near the entrance he found the same narrow footprints we had followed from the moor. They continued toward the altar but stopped abruptly. "She vanished," I said. "No," said Holmes. "She removed her shoes." He pointed toward a dusty patch of floor. 2 faint impressions showed where a pair of shoes had been placed. Beyond them were bare footprints leading toward the rear wall. "Why would anyone do that?" I asked. Holmes did not answer. He was examining the wall. Suddenly he pressed his fingers against one of the stones. A section moved inward with a soft click. Behind it was a narrow cavity. Inside lay a small black leather case. Holmes took it out and opened the clasp. There was nothing inside except a single brass key and a folded piece of paper. He opened the paper and read it in silence. "What does it say?" I asked. Holmes handed it to me. Written in faded ink were 7 words. "The truth lies where the bell once rang." I looked toward the roofless tower. "The bell tower." "Precisely." Holmes slipped the key into his pocket. At that moment we heard a sound outside, a footstep. Then another. Someone was walking around the chapel. Holmes extinguished the small lantern he had been carrying and motioned for me to remain silent. The footsteps stopped. For several seconds there was absolute silence. Then the door creaked open. A shadow appeared against the grey mist. I reached instinctively for my revolver, but Holmes caught my wrist. "Wait!" The figure entered slowly. It was a woman dressed in a dark traveling cloak. Her face was hidden beneath a veil. She stood perfectly still, apparently listening. Then she whispered a single name. Reginald. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The woman took one step toward the altar. "I know you are here," she said. Holmes moved forward. "Then you know rather more than most people, madam." The woman froze. For one extraordinary instant I believed we had caught the mysterious stranger. But she turned suddenly, threw a small object onto the floor, and fled through the broken doorway. A cloud of white smoke filled the chapel. I coughed violently, my eyes streaming, while Holmes remained remarkably calm. By the time the smoke cleared, the woman had disappeared. Upon the floor lay a small silver locket. Holmes picked it up and examined it. There was a miniature portrait inside. I recognized the face immediately. It was Sir Reginald Wexford. On the reverse were 4 engraved words. "Forgive me, Eleanor." Holmes stared at the inscription for several seconds. "Eleanor Wexford," I whispered. "Sir Reginald's daughter." "Indeed." He closed the locket. "And now, Watson, we have a young woman who apparently knows more about her father's death than she has told the police." "Do you believe she killed him?" "No." Holmes looked toward the doorway through which the woman had escaped. "I believe she is frightened." "Of the police?" "No." He turned the brass key between his fingers. "Of someone who is still alive." At that precise moment, a distant church bell sounded from the village. Holmes looked toward the ruined tower. "Curious," he said. "There has been no bell in this chapel for 40 years. He moved toward the tower with sudden purpose. "Come, Watson. I suspect we are about to discover why a dead bell has begun to ring." The sound of the bell had scarcely faded before Holmes was already moving toward the ruined tower. I followed him across the uneven floor of the chapel, stepping carefully over broken stones and fragments of ancient timber. The narrow stairway that led upward was little more than a succession of crumbling steps cut into the wall, and I confess that I felt some reluctance at the prospect of climbing it. The tower had been exposed to the weather for decades, and every gust of wind seemed to bring another shower of dust from above. Holmes, however, ascended with the confidence of a man who had already formed a theory and intended to test it. "You heard the bell, Watson?" he asked. "Certainly." "And where did the sound seem to come from?" "From the tower. There lies our difficulty." "Why?" Holmes paused halfway up the staircase and looked down at me. "Because there is no bell." We continued upward until we reached the top of the tower. The roof had long since disappeared, leaving the chamber open to the grey sky. A rusted iron frame remained where the bell had once hung, but it was empty. The great bell itself had been removed many years before, yet beside the frame Holmes discovered a length of fresh rope. It was wet with condensation and showed several strands of new fiber. He lifted it carefully. "Someone has pulled this within the last few hours." I stared at him. "But if there is no bell—" "Exactly." He turned toward the opening in the tower wall. "Sound does not always require the object we associate with it." He pointed downward. "Listen." We waited. At first there was nothing. Then, faintly, came another metallic note from somewhere beneath us. It was lower than the first, and seemed strangely hollow. Holmes smiled. "A signal." "A signal to whom?" "That is what we must discover." He examined the rope more closely and found a small smear of black substance upon it. He touched it with his finger, smelled it, and immediately wiped his hand on a handkerchief. "Coal dust," he said. "There is a railway nearby, 2 miles south." "Then our unknown friend has been in contact with something connected to the railway." I was about to reply when a voice called from below. It was Lestrade. We descended and found the inspector standing beside the chapel entrance. His expression was grim. "Holmes, you had better come with me." "Why?" "We've found something." "Another body?" "No. Vane has disappeared." I confess that the news surprised me. "Disappeared?" I asked. "He was being held at the edge of the moor," said Lestrade. 2 constables were watching him while the others searched the ground. One of them turned away for perhaps 30 seconds. When he looked back, Vane was gone. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Was he handcuffed?" "Yes." "And the constables remained together?" "Yes." "Interesting." "You always say that when something isn't interesting at all," Lestrade growled. "Where did he go?" "We don't know." Holmes examined the ground near the place where Vane had been standing. There were several deep impressions in the mud, but the marks had been disturbed by the searchers. After a moment, Holmes pointed toward a stone. "What is that?" Lestrade looked down. It was a small brass button. "It came from Vane's coat," he said. Holmes shook his head. "No. His coat has wooden buttons." Lestrade stared at him. "Then whose is it?" Holmes slipped it into his pocket. "That is one of the questions we shall answer later. You think someone helped him escape? I think someone wanted him to disappear. Is there a difference?" "A considerable one." Holmes turned toward the moor. "Take me to the place where Vane was last seen." As we walked, Lestrade explained that Vane had behaved strangely since his arrest. He had repeatedly asked whether Sir Reginald's daughter had been found. When told that Miss Wexford was still at the family estate, he had become visibly agitated. "Did he say why?" Holmes asked. "No, but he did say something rather peculiar." "What?" He said, "If Eleanor is still at the Hall, then the murderer has already won." Holmes stopped walking. "Did he say anything else?" "Only this: don't let them take her to the old house." "The old house, yes." Holmes's face became thoughtful. "And where is this old house?" "On the Wexford estate." "Abandoned?" "For more than 20 years." "Excellent." Lestrade frowned. "Excellent? We have now acquired 3 locations: the moor, the chapel, and an abandoned house. Criminals are remarkably considerate when they provide a detective with a map. We reached the spot where Vane had disappeared. Holmes knelt and examined the earth. The ground was muddy, but the recent rain had washed away many of the impressions. He studied the handcuffs lying in the grass. One of them was still locked. The other had been opened. "How?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes held the cuff toward the light. "With a key." "He didn't have one." "No." Holmes examined the lock, "but someone else did." "Then we are looking for an accomplice." "Not necessarily." "What do you mean?" Holmes pointed to the grass. "There is no second set of footprints leaving this place." Lestrade looked puzzled. "Then how did Vane escape?" Holmes rose. "He did not." The inspector stared at him. "But he is gone." "Yes, so he must have left." "Not on foot." Holmes walked several yards toward a narrow ditch. There, concealed beneath reeds, was a shallow wooden platform mounted upon small iron wheels. It was scarcely large enough for a man to lie upon. A rope extended from it into the ditch and disappeared toward the railway embankment. "A trolley," I said. "Exactly," Holmes replied. "Someone placed Vane upon this and pulled him beneath the reeds while the constable was distracted." Lestrade cursed under his breath. "Then he has been taken to the railway." Holmes shook his head. "No. Look at the rope." I examined it and saw that it had been cut. "It ends here." "Which means," Holmes said quietly, "that whoever arranged this wanted us to believe the prisoner had been taken toward the railway." "Another false trail?" "Yes." Holmes looked across the mist-covered moor. "And the question is why someone would go to such extraordinary lengths to rescue Samuel Vane." Before Lestrade could answer, a distant whistle sounded. It came from the direction of the railway. Holmes's head turned sharply. "That is no ordinary train whistle. How can you tell?" I asked. "Because there is no scheduled train at this hour." Lestrade glanced at his watch. "Then what is it?" Holmes was already walking toward the sound. "A message." We followed him across the moor until the ground rose sharply before us. From the crest we could see a single railway carriage standing motionless on a distant siding. No engine was attached to it. A man stood beside the carriage holding a lantern. Holmes raised his field glass. For several seconds he watched in silence. Then he lowered it. "Watson, do you remember the woman at the chapel?" "Of course. She wore a dark traveling cloak." "Yes, there is a woman standing beside that carriage." I raised the glass. The distance made her features impossible to distinguish, but her silhouette was unmistakable. She was holding something in her hands. "Is it Eleanor?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Then he said, "No." "How can you know?" "Because Miss Eleanor Wexford is currently standing at the window of Wexford Hall." I stared at him. "You are certain?" "I am." "Then who is that woman?" Holmes lowered the glass. "Someone who wishes us to believe she is Eleanor." At that moment the woman beside the carriage raised a lantern and gave 3 slow signals. Holmes watched carefully. His expression changed. "What is it?" I asked. "The same signal as the bell." "And what does it mean?" "I don't know yet." He looked toward the distant carriage. "But I know where we are going next. We had taken only a few steps when a shot rang across the moor. The lantern dropped from the woman's hand. She collapsed beside the railway carriage. Holmes began running. Lestrade and I followed. Yet before we reached the tracks, the carriage doors slammed shut, and the empty train began to move slowly into the mist. Holmes stopped beside the fallen lantern and examined the ground. There was no blood, no body, nothing but a single black glove lying in the wet grass. He picked it up and looked inside. Sewn into the lining were 3 letters. E.W. Holmes's face became very grave. "Watson," he said, "I fear that Miss Eleanor Wexford has just become the most important person in this entire affair. Because the glove bears her initials? No?" Holmes looked toward the vanishing railway carriage. "Because the initials are false." The railway carriage disappeared into the mist before we could reach it, leaving behind only the fading clatter of wheels and the faint smell of coal smoke. Lestrade stood beside the track, staring after it with an expression of profound irritation, while Holmes remained perfectly still, the black glove hanging from his fingertips. "You said the initials were false," I remarked. "How do you know?" Holmes turned the glove inside out. "Because the stitching is wrong." I examined it but could detect nothing unusual. "The letters are sewn into the lining," Holmes explained. "The thread is new, while the glove itself is old. More importantly, the initials were added after the lining was manufactured. Whoever did it wished us to identify the owner quickly." "And you believe the owner is not Eleanor Wexford?" "I believe the glove was intended to create that impression." Lestrade shook his head. "Holmes, we have a murdered baronet, a missing prisoner, a woman running about in disguise, a mysterious railway carriage, and now a glove with forged initials. Where exactly do you propose we begin?" Holmes looked toward the dark outline of Wexford Hall in the distance. "With the daughter. We hired a carriage from the village and reached the Wexford estate shortly before noon. The fog had lifted somewhat, revealing a bleak country house standing beyond a long avenue of ancient trees. Wexford Hall was an imposing stone building, though its grandeur had suffered beneath years of neglect. Several windows were boarded, ivy covered one side of the walls, and the iron gates were badly rusted. Yet there was an unmistakable air of wealth about the place. A grey-haired butler admitted us. He appeared deeply disturbed by the events of the morning and repeatedly glanced toward the upper floors. "Miss Wexford is expecting you," he said. Holmes paused in the entrance hall. "What is your name?" "Thomas Bell." "How long have you served Sir Reginald?" 26 years. "Then you knew him well?" The butler lowered his eyes. "Very well indeed, sir." Holmes looked at the staircase. "And Miss Eleanor?" "She has been in the library since breakfast." "Alone?" "Yes." "Has she left the house today?" Bell hesitated. "No, sir." Holmes smiled faintly. "Thank you." We were led into a large library lined with dark wooden shelves. Eleanor Wexford stood beside the window. She was perhaps 28 years of age, pale and slender, with dark hair tied loosely behind her head. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was something firm in her expression that suggested she had inherited her father's strength of character. "Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, "I know why you have come. Then perhaps you can save us some time." She looked at Lestrade. "You believe I know who killed my father?" "Do you?" Lestrade asked. Eleanor did not answer. Instead, she turned toward Holmes. "My father was not the man people believed him to be." Holmes's interest sharpened. "In what respect?" "He had secrets. Everyone has secrets. His were dangerous." She walked to the fireplace and stared into the flames. For the past 6 months he had become increasingly frightened. He locked his study every evening. He received letters without addresses. Sometimes men came to the hall at night and left before dawn. "Did you recognize any of them?" Holmes asked. "One." "Who?" Eleanor hesitated. "Samuel Vane." Lestrade immediately stepped forward. "So Vane was visiting your father secretly?" "Yes." "Why?" "I don't know. Yet you defended him." "Because I know he did not kill my father." Holmes studied her face. "Why are you certain?" "Because Samuel came to me last night." "At what time?" "Shortly before 9. "And what did he say?" Eleanor's hands tightened around the edge of the mantelpiece. "He warned me to leave the hall." "Why?" "He said my father had been betrayed." Holmes's expression remained neutral. "By whom?" "He would not say." "What happened next?" My father entered the room. He and Samuel argued, then Samuel left. And your father? He told me to forget the matter, yet he left the house shortly afterward. Yes. Did he tell you where he was going? No. Holmes walked slowly around the library. He examined the writing desk, the bookshelves, and finally the carpet near the door. Miss Wexford, he said, have you been outside today? No. Have you received any visitors? No. Holmes looked down at the floor. Interesting. What is? I asked. He pointed toward a small patch of damp earth near the French windows. Someone entered this room from outside. Eleanor looked astonished. That is impossible. Not at all. Holmes knelt. The impression is faint but unmistakable. A narrow shoe, wet at the heel. Lestrade drew his revolver. Could the woman from the chapel have come here? Holmes shook his head. No. Why not? Because the person who made this impression entered before the fog lifted. The woman at the chapel left afterward. He looked toward Eleanor. You said no one visited you? No one that I saw. Holmes stood. That is a different answer. Eleanor's face changed. Mr. Holmes, there is something I must tell you. Before she could continue, a loud crash came from the corridor. We rushed outside. A servant was standing beside the open door of Sir Reginald's study, trembling violently. The room, he gasped. Someone has been inside. Holmes pushed past him. Sir Reginald's study was a severe room, with heavy curtains, a large desk, and shelves filled with legal documents. Several drawers had been opened. Papers lay scattered across the carpet, yet nothing appeared to have been stolen. Holmes went directly to the desk. Lestrade, look at this. On the polished surface was a thin layer of dust. In the middle of it was a clean rectangular space. Something stood here, Lestrade said. Yes. Holmes examined the empty space carefully. Something approximately 8 inches long. Eleanor entered behind us. Her face went pale. The box. Holmes turned. What box? My father's black box. Where was it kept? There. She pointed toward the desk. He never allowed anyone to touch it. What was inside? I don't know. Did your father ever mention it? Eleanor nodded slowly. Once. What did he say? He told me that if anything happened to him, I was never to open it. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Did he give you a reason? He said that some truths were more dangerous than lies. Holmes stood silently for several seconds, then he turned to the butler. Mr. Bell, who has a key to this room. Sir Reginald, Miss Eleanor, and myself. Anyone else? No. Where is your key? Bell produced it from his pocket. Holmes examined it and handed it back. And Miss Wexford, Eleanor showed him her key. Holmes compared the two. Neither has been used recently. Lestrade looked puzzled. Then how was the door opened? Holmes smiled. It wasn't. He pointed to the lock. The door was never locked. But Bell said he believed it was locked. Holmes turned to the butler. You did not actually test the door this morning, did you? Bell looked ashamed. No, sir. Holmes nodded. Then our intruder entered through an unlocked door. He returned to the desk. But the important question is not who entered. What is it? I asked. Holmes looked toward the empty space where the black box had been. Who knew it was here? At that moment there came a faint tapping from somewhere inside the room. Everyone froze. Tap, tap, tap. It came again. Eleanor looked frightened. What is that? Holmes raised one finger for silence. The tapping continued, 3 times, then stopped. Holmes walked toward the wall behind the bookcase. He examined it carefully and pressed his ear against the wood. Watson, bring the lamp. I held it toward him. Holmes removed 3 books from the shelf. Behind them was a narrow opening. From within came a faint draft of cold air. A passage, I whispered. Yes. Holmes looked at Eleanor. And I suspect, Miss Wexford, that your father's secrets were not confined to the papers on his desk. He pushed the bookcase aside. Beyond it was a dark stone passage leading into the heart of the house. We entered cautiously. The passage descended beneath the hall, where the air became colder and smelled faintly of damp earth. After perhaps 50 yards, Holmes stopped beside a wooden door. On it was carved a symbol, a circle crossed by 3 lines. He examined it closely. Watson, have you ever seen this mark? Never. Neither had I until this morning. Where did you see it? Holmes opened his hand. In his palm was the brass button we had found beside the place where Vane disappeared. The same symbol was engraved upon it. Before we could examine it further, a sound came from behind the door. Someone was breathing. Holmes raised his revolver. "Who is there?" Silence. Then a man's voice answered from the darkness, "If you are Sherlock Holmes, you are already too late." Holmes's expression hardened. "Open the door." A low laugh came from within. "You have followed the wrong trail, Mr. Holmes. The murderer is not in this house." Holmes glanced at me. "Then where is he?" The voice answered softly. "Where the dead man began his journey." There was a sudden metallic click. Holmes seized my arm and pulled me backward. The door burst open. A cloud of smoke poured into the passage. When it cleared, the room beyond was empty. On the stone floor lay only one object, a folded railway timetable. Holmes picked it up and studied the marked line. His face became grave. "Watson," he said, "we have been searching for the murderer at the end of the journey." He folded the timetable carefully. "Now we must discover where Sir Reginald boarded the train." The railway timetable which Holmes had discovered in the hidden passage contained nothing remarkable at first glance. It was an ordinary printed schedule of trains serving the southern counties, stained at one corner and folded twice across the middle. Yet Holmes studied it with the intense concentration which he ordinarily reserved for documents of the greatest importance. We had returned to the library, where Lestrade stood impatiently beside the fireplace while Eleanor Wexford watched my friend with an anxiety she made little attempt to conceal. "The timetable is dated last month," said Lestrade. "There are hundreds of copies in existence." "Quite so," Holmes replied, "which is why the interesting portion is not the timetable itself, but what has been done to it." He spread the paper upon the desk and pointed to several tiny marks in pencil. They appeared at first to be nothing more than careless strokes, but Holmes arranged the folds so that the marks aligned with one another. "There," he said, "a series of stations. Wexford Junction, Red Marsh, Blackwater and Ashcombe," I read. "Exactly." He tapped the last name. "Ashcombe." Eleanor stepped forward. "There is an old station there." "An abandoned one?" Holmes asked. "Almost. It has not been used for passengers in years." "But trains still pass it?" "Freight trains, occasionally." Holmes nodded. "Then our mystery has acquired a railway." Lestrade looked irritated. "And what does that tell us?" "That Sir Reginald did not necessarily travel from the station we have been investigating. Why would he go to an abandoned station? Perhaps he did not." Holmes folded the timetable. "Perhaps someone wished us to believe he did." I watched my friend closely. There was a subtle alteration in his manner. Until that moment he had been following the evidence wherever it led. Now it seemed to me that he was beginning to anticipate his opponent. "Holmes," I said, "you said the murderer was not in the house." "The voice said so." "And you believed it?" He smiled. "No, Watson, but the voice was useful." "Useful?" "Whoever spoke knew that we had discovered the passage. He also knew my name. More importantly, he knew that we would associate the railway timetable with Sir Reginald's movements. Such information cannot have come from a casual observer." "Then someone inside the estate is involved," Lestrade said. "Possibly." Holmes looked toward Eleanor. "Miss Wexford, I want you to answer one question carefully. Did your father ever visit Ashcombe?" Eleanor hesitated. "Yes." "When?" "Several times during the last year." "Did he tell you why?" "No." "Did anyone accompany him?" "Once, I believe." "Who?" Her eyes moved toward the door. "Thomas Bell." Lestrade immediately summoned the butler. Bell entered a minute later, his expression composed but noticeably tense. Holmes pointed to the chair. "Sit down, Mr. Bell." "Certainly, sir." "You have accompanied Sir Reginald to Ashcombe?" Bell's eyes flickered toward Eleanor. "Once." "When?" 3 months ago." "Why?" "Sir Reginald instructed me to drive him there." "What happened?" "He met someone." "Who?" "I don't know." Holmes smiled. "You have just contradicted yourself." Bell stiffened. "I beg your pardon?" "You said you did not know the person, yet you know enough to say Sir Reginald met someone. How?" "I saw him speaking with a gentleman." "Then you saw him?" "Yes." "Describe him." Bell lowered his eyes. "Tall, dark coat, grey hat, age, perhaps 50, face." "I could not see it clearly." Holmes leaned back. "Did the gentleman arrive by train?" "No." "By carriage?" "I believe so." "You believe?" Bell's hands tightened upon his knees. "There was a carriage nearby." "And did Sir Reginald give the man anything?" Bell remained silent. Holmes waited. The silence lengthened until even Lestrade appeared uncomfortable. Finally the butler said, "A key." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "What sort of key?" "A brass key." I felt a sudden chill. Holmes slowly reached into his pocket and placed the key found in the chapel upon the table. Bell stared at it. His reaction was unmistakable. "That is the one," he whispered. Holmes closed his fingers around it. "Thank you, Mr. Bell." "What does it open?" Eleanor asked. Bell looked at her with genuine fear. "I do not know." "You do," Holmes said quietly, "and if you wish to remain alive, I suggest that you remember." Bell's face had become ashen. "Sir Reginald told me never to speak of it." "Sir Reginald is dead." "Exactly." Holmes rose. "And those who kept his secrets alive are now concerned that they may die with him." Before Bell could answer, there came a violent knock at the front door. A servant hurried into the hall, followed by a uniformed railway porter. The man was breathing heavily. "Inspector," he said, "we found something on the Ashcombe line." Lestrade stepped forward. "What?" "A coat." "Whose?" "We believe it belonged to Sir Reginald Wexford." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "Take us there." The porter led us to a small railway siding nearly 3 miles from Wexford Hall. By the time we arrived, darkness had begun to gather over the countryside. The abandoned station was a miserable little structure of brick and broken glass, surrounded by weeds and rusting railway equipment. A single lamp burned above the platform, flickering in the wind. Beneath a wooden bench lay the coat. It was a heavy black overcoat of excellent quality, soaked with rain. Holmes examined it carefully. "It is Sir Reginald's," Eleanor said when she saw it. "There is no doubt." Holmes raised one hand. "Please do not touch it." He turned the coat over. The left sleeve was torn near the elbow, and a dark stain marked the cuff. "Blood?" Lestrade asked. Holmes touched the edge of the stain with a small instrument. "Yes." Lestrade looked triumphant. "Then he was attacked here." "Not necessarily." Holmes examined the ground beneath the bench. "Look at these marks." There were several impressions in the mud. One pair belonged to heavy boots. Another pair was much narrower. Holmes followed them toward the far end of the platform, where they disappeared near an old signal box. "The narrow shoes again?" I said. "Yes." "The woman?" "Possibly." Holmes entered the signal box. Inside was a rusted lever mechanism and a small wooden table. On the table lay a half-burned candle. Beside it was a sheet of paper covered with numbers. Holmes studied it. "Watson, read the second column." I did so. 9, 12, 7, 3, 11. And the first? 4, 2, 8, 6, 5. Interesting. A code? Perhaps. He looked at the railway map hanging on the wall. "No, it is a sequence." "A sequence of what?" Holmes pointed toward the railway tracks. "Train movements." Lestrade entered behind us. "What have you found?" Holmes handed him the paper. Someone was recording the passage of trains. Why? Because one of them carried something important. Suddenly there was a loud metallic clang outside. We rushed onto the platform. A freight train was approaching from the north, its engine emerging from the darkness like some enormous black beast. Holmes raised his lantern and waved frantically. The driver sounded the whistle, but the train continued. Then Holmes saw something attached to the final carriage. "There!" he shouted. A man was standing upon the rear platform. He wore a dark coat and a grey hat. In his hand was a lantern. He raised it 3 times. The same signal we had seen at the Moor. Holmes ran alongside the tracks. The man stared directly at him. Then he threw something onto the platform. It struck the ground and rolled to my feet. I picked it up. It was a silver watch. Holmes stopped immediately. "Watson, give it to me." He opened the case. Inside the cover were engraved the initials R.W. Sir Reginald's watch, I said. "Yes." "Then he must have been on that train." Holmes shook his head. "No." "Why not?" "Because the watch has stopped." He held it to his ear. "At 11:17. Lestrade looked at his own watch. That was the approximate time Sir Reginald died. Holmes nodded. "Which means the watch was deliberately stopped at the moment of death. Then the murderer threw it from the train." "Perhaps." Holmes turned the watch over. On its back was a tiny scratch that had not been visible before. He took out his magnifying glass. "A symbol." I leaned closer. It was the same circle crossed by 3 lines that we had seen on the brass button beneath Wexford Hall. Holmes's expression became grave. "This is no longer a private murder, Watson." "What do you mean?" "Sir Reginald was involved in something organized." "What sort of organization?" Holmes looked toward the darkness where the freight train had vanished. "I do not yet know. But we have the symbol." "Yes." "And the key." "Yes." "And the black box, which has disappeared." I stared at him. "You think the box contained the truth?" "I think the box contained something that someone was willing to kill for." At that moment a voice came from behind the signal box. "You are wrong, Mr. Holmes." We turned. A man stood in the shadows. His face was hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The box contained nothing. Holmes stepped forward. "Then why was it stolen?" The stranger laughed softly. "Because what matters is not what was inside." "Then what? Who opened it?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Who?" The man lifted a revolver. "Ask Eleanor Wexford." A shot rang through the night. When the smoke cleared, the stranger had vanished. And Eleanor, who had been standing only a few feet from us, was staring at her own hands in horror. In her palm was a small brass key, the same key Holmes had found in the ruined chapel. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "I swear I have never seen it before." Holmes looked at the key, then at Eleanor. For the first time since the beginning of the case, I saw something approaching genuine alarm in his eyes. "Watson," he said quietly, "I believe we have just discovered the first lie in this investigation that was not told by the murderer." For several seconds after the shot, none of us moved. The night seemed to have swallowed the sound, leaving only the distant clatter of the freight train and the restless hiss of steam along the railway line. Eleanor stood before us, pale and trembling, the brass key still lying in the center of her open palm. Lestrade had drawn his revolver and was staring into the darkness beyond the signal box, while Holmes remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed upon the young woman. "Miss Wexford," he said at last, "where did you get that key?" "I do not know." "It was not in your possession a moment ago?" "No." "Then how did it come into your hand?" Eleanor shook her head helplessly. "I cannot explain it." Lestrade stepped toward her. "Holmes," she was standing beside us. The stranger disappeared, and suddenly the key was there. "Either she is lying or someone placed it there," Holmes interrupted. He took the key from Eleanor and examined it beneath the station lamp. "Watson, observe the metal." I bent over it. The brass was darkened with age, but one side showed a tiny smear of something reddish. "Blood?" I asked. "Not blood." Holmes touched it with the tip of his knife and smelled it. "Sealing wax." "Sealing wax?" Lestrade repeated. "Why would there be sealing wax on a key?" "Because the key has recently been hidden inside something sealed." Holmes turned toward Eleanor. "Miss Wexford, did your father ever give you anything wrapped in paper?" She stared at him. "No." "Think carefully." She closed her eyes. "There was a letter." "When?" "Yesterday afternoon." "From whom?" "I don't know." "Where is it?" Eleanor's face suddenly changed. "In my bedroom." Holmes immediately turned to Lestrade. "We must return to the hall." "You think the letter matters?" "I think everything connected with that key matters." We hurried back to the estate, and I confess that the drive seemed considerably longer than the outward journey. Eleanor remained silent beside me, while Holmes sat opposite, his eyes closed and his fingertips pressed together. Once or twice I caught him examining the brass key. At last I could restrain myself no longer. "Holmes, what did you mean when you said that the first lie was not told by the murderer?" He opened his eyes. "I meant precisely what I said. You believe Eleanor is lying?" "No." "Then who lied?" "Someone who wants us to believe that Eleanor knows nothing." "But why?" Holmes looked out into the darkness. "Because innocence can be as useful a disguise as guilt." When we arrived at Wexford Hall, Holmes instructed Lestrade to secure every entrance. Bell met us in the hall. His expression changed when he saw Eleanor. "Miss Eleanor," he exclaimed, "are you unharmed?" "Yes." Bell looked relieved, but Holmes noticed the man's hands. "You are trembling, Mr. Bell. It has been a terrible night, sir." "Indeed." Holmes stepped closer. "Have you entered Miss Wexford's room since yesterday afternoon?" "No." "Are you certain?" "Absolutely." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then you will not object to accompanying us." Eleanor led us upstairs. Her room was at the eastern end of the house and overlooked the gardens. Holmes entered first and examined the carpet, the curtains and the window latch. He then approached the dressing table. A small envelope lay beside a silver hairbrush. "Is that the letter?" he asked. Eleanor nodded. Holmes did not touch it immediately. Instead, he inspected the surface with his magnifying glass. "Interesting. What is it?" I asked. "The envelope has been opened." "But I never opened it," Eleanor said. "Perhaps someone else did." Holmes lifted it carefully. "No, the seal was broken from the inside." Lestrade frowned. "That is impossible." Holmes held the envelope toward the lamp. "Not impossible, merely unusual." He opened it and removed a single sheet of paper. The writing consisted of only one sentence. "When the bell rings for the third time, remember what your father buried." Eleanor read the words and covered her mouth. "I have never seen this." Holmes looked at her. "Yet you have read it before." "No, you have." "I swear I have not." Holmes folded the paper. "Then someone has written it knowing what you have forgotten." Eleanor stared at him. "What do you mean?" Holmes walked to the window. "You told us this morning that your father had become frightened during the last 6 months. You told us he locked his study, received mysterious letters, and met men secretly. Yet you never mentioned the old house, Ashcombe, or the chapel. I didn't know about them. You knew enough to know that your father was hiding something." "Yes." "And you knew enough to recognize Samuel Vane's warning." She looked confused. "What warning?" "He told you to leave the hall." Eleanor nodded. "Yes, but he did not tell you where to go." "No." Holmes turned. "Yet you went nowhere." She looked down. "I was frightened." Holmes studied her carefully. "Or you were waiting." "Waiting for what?" "That is what I am trying to discover." The room became silent. Suddenly Eleanor gave a sharp gasp. She had moved toward the wardrobe and was staring at the floor. "What is it?" I asked. She pointed beneath the bed. Holmes knelt and looked underneath. A small wooden box had been pushed into the darkness. He drew it out. The box was old and blackened by smoke. There was no lock. "This was not here yesterday," Eleanor whispered. Holmes opened it. Inside was a collection of objects: a railway ticket, a silver button, a dried sprig of heather, and a photograph. He lifted the photograph carefully. It showed Sir Reginald standing beside 3 other men outside an unfamiliar building. I recognized Thomas Bell immediately. "The butler," I exclaimed. "Yes," said Holmes, "but who are the others?" "One was a tall man with a grey hat. The second was Samuel Vane. The third man stood partly in shadow. His face was turned away from the camera." Holmes examined the photograph for several moments. "This was taken at Ashcombe." Eleanor shook her head. "My father never told me about it." "Perhaps he did," Holmes said. "Perhaps you simply forgot." "I would not forget something like this." Holmes looked at her strangely. "Would you?" Eleanor's expression changed. "What are you suggesting?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he examined the railway ticket. "This was issued 18 months ago." Lestrade leaned over his shoulder. "Destination? Blackwater. But why would Sir Reginald travel there?" Holmes turned the ticket over. Written on the reverse was a single letter, E. "Eleanor," I said. Holmes shook his head. "Not necessarily." He placed the ticket beside the photograph. "We have made the same mistake repeatedly in this case. We see a letter and assume it is an initial. We see a footprint and assume it belongs to the person whose shoe resembles it. We see a body upon the moor and assume the man died there." "Then what should we assume?" Lestrade asked. "Nothing." Holmes looked toward the window. "We should establish." At that instant the great clock in the entrance hall began to strike. 1, 2, 3. The third chime had barely faded when a sound came from the corridor outside Eleanor's room. A slow scrape, followed by footsteps. Holmes immediately extinguished the lamp. We stood in darkness. The footsteps approached. One step, then another. They stopped outside the door. The handle moved. Holmes motioned to Lestrade, who positioned himself beside the entrance. The door opened slowly. A figure stepped into the room. Holmes seized the intruder before he could react. There was a brief struggle, and the stranger fell heavily against the wall. Lestrade struck a match. The face revealed beneath the hood was that of Thomas Bell. "Bell!" I exclaimed. The butler looked terrified. Holmes held him firmly by the wrist. "Why were you here?" "I heard a noise." "At precisely the third bell?" Bell's mouth opened, but no answer came. Holmes searched his coat. From an inner pocket, he produced a small packet wrapped in oilskin. Inside was a second brass key. Lestrade stared at it. Another one? Holmes examined it carefully. Yes. Then what does it open? We shall soon find out. Bell suddenly pulled free and ran toward the window. Lestrade caught him before he could reach it. Holmes remained calm. You will tell us everything now, Mr. Bell. The old servant looked at Eleanor. There was sorrow in his eyes. I cannot. Why? Bell swallowed. Because Sir Reginald ordered me to protect her. Eleanor stared at him. Protect me from whom? Bell looked toward Holmes. From the man who killed him. Holmes's expression hardened. Who is he? Bell lowered his voice. The man you have been calling Samuel Vane. Lestrade reacted immediately. But Vane is innocent. No, Bell whispered. He is not. Then what is he? Holmes asked. Bell closed his eyes. He is the man who helped Sir Reginald disappear 18 months ago. I felt a chill run through me. Disappear? Bell nodded. Sir Reginald Wexford was declared ill for 3 weeks that winter. He never left his room, or so we were told. Holmes's eyes narrowed. But he was at Ashcombe. Yes. With Vane. Yes. And the third man? Bell looked toward the black box on the table. That man was never supposed to be seen again. Who was he? Bell hesitated. Then a voice came from the darkness behind us. He was my brother. Eleanor turned sharply. A woman stood in the doorway. It was the mysterious stranger from the chapel. She had removed her veil, revealing a face that was pale, frightened, and strangely familiar. Holmes stared at her for several seconds. Then his expression changed. Good heavens, I exclaimed. She resembles Miss Wexford. The woman looked directly at Eleanor. Because we are sisters. The room seemed to become colder. Eleanor stepped backward. I have no sister. The woman gave a sad smile. That is what they wanted you to believe. Holmes moved toward her. Your name? The woman looked at him. Clara Wexford. Holmes's eyes flashed with sudden understanding. And now, he said quietly, we may finally learn what Sir Reginald buried beneath Blackwater Moor. Clara's expression became one of terror. No, Mr. Holmes. She shook her head. You must not go there. Why? Because the grave is empty. Clara Wexford's words seemed to hang in the room long after she had spoken them. The fire had burned low, and the faint orange glow upon the walls appeared almost unnatural against the darkness beyond the windows. Eleanor stood motionless, staring at the woman who had just claimed to be her sister, while Lestrade kept one hand upon his revolver. Bell, meanwhile, had sunk into a chair, his face grey with exhaustion. Only Holmes remained composed. He regarded Clara with that peculiar stillness which I had come to recognize as the outward sign of his most intense concentration. You say the grave is empty, he said. Whose grave? Clara's eyes moved toward Eleanor. Our father's. Eleanor gave a cry of disbelief. My father has not been buried. Not Sir Reginald, Clara replied. The other grave. Holmes's expression sharpened. Then you had better begin at the beginning. Clara lowered her head. 18 months ago, my father discovered that someone was stealing money from the Wexford estate. He suspected that the theft was connected with a much older secret. He began investigating quietly, with the help of Samuel Vane. They found records hidden beneath the old chapel, records concerning land that had been transferred illegally many years before. Several powerful men were involved. Names? Holmes asked. My father never told me all of them. He believed someone was watching him. And your brother? I asked. Clara looked at me. His name was Adrian. Eleanor stared at her. I had a brother? Clara nodded sadly. A twin brother. Eleanor's face became utterly blank. Holmes watched her closely. You truly do not remember? No, she whispered. I have no memory of him. Clara stepped nearer. You were 7 years old when he died. Eleanor shook her head. I was told I was an only child, because your father believed it would protect you. Holmes raised a hand. Let us be precise. You said Adrian died. How? Clara's expression hardened. He disappeared. Holmes moved toward the desk and leaned against it. Then the grave you mentioned belonged to no one. That is what we believed, Clara replied. A grave was prepared 18 months ago, after my father claimed Adrian had finally been found dead. But when I went there last night, the coffin was empty. Why did you go? Because I received a message. From whom? Clara removed a folded piece of paper from beneath her cloak. Holmes took it and read the words. "Come to the old chapel. The truth about Adrian waits beneath the bell." He examined the paper carefully. "When did you receive this?" "Yesterday afternoon." "Before or after Sir Reginald left the hall?" "Before." Holmes folded the message. "And you went to the chapel?" "Yes." "Where you found us?" "Yes." "Then why did you flee?" Clara's eyes filled with fear. "Because someone else was there." "Who?" "I do not know. I heard a man's voice behind the chapel wall. He said my name. I became frightened and ran." Holmes's gaze shifted toward Bell. "Did you know about Clara?" Bell remained silent. "Mr. Bell," Holmes said quietly, "you have served this family for 26 years. You knew there were 2 children." The old butler closed his eyes. "Yes." Eleanor stepped toward him. "Why did you lie to me?" Bell looked at her with sorrow. "Because your father commanded me to. He erased my brother from my life. He believed it was necessary." "And Clara?" "Miss Clara was sent away after Adrian disappeared." Clara nodded. "I was told never to return." Holmes studied the 3 of them. "Yet you returned now." "Because my father is dead, and because you believe Adrian may still be alive." Clara hesitated. "I do not merely believe it." She looked toward the window. "I saw him." The room fell silent. Lestrade frowned. "You saw your dead brother?" 3 nights ago." "Where?" "At Ashcombe Station." Holmes immediately turned to me. "Watson, the photograph." I retrieved it from the desk. Holmes held it beside Clara's face. "You were there?" "Yes." "And Adrian?" Clara pointed toward the shadowed figure in the photograph. "There." Holmes studied the image. The man stood behind Sir Reginald and Vane, his face deliberately turned away. "This photograph was taken 18 months ago," Holmes said. "You claim you saw Adrian 3 nights ago. I know what I saw." "Did he speak?" "No." "Did he know you?" He looked directly at me. Holmes's expression remained thoughtful. "And what happened?" "He disappeared before I could reach him." "Into the station?" "No." "Toward the old railway tunnel." Holmes immediately picked up his coat. "Then we shall go there." Lestrade protested. "Now? It is nearly midnight." Holmes looked at him. "Inspector, if there is a living man connected with a supposedly empty grave, I would prefer to find him before dawn." Within 20 minutes we were once more upon the road. The journey to Ashcombe was made in almost complete silence. Holmes sat opposite me, studying the photograph by the light of the carriage lamp. At length I asked him what he believed. "I believe that Adrian Wexford may be alive." "Then why would Sir Reginald tell everyone that he was dead?" "That is the question. Could Adrian be involved in his father's murder? Possibly. Could Clara be lying? Certainly. And Belle? Almost certainly." I laughed despite myself. "You have a comforting faith in human honesty, Holmes." He smiled. "I have very little faith in honesty, Watson, but I have considerable faith in contradictions." When we reached Ashcombe, the station was deserted. The wind swept across the empty platform, carrying the smell of rain and coal smoke. Holmes led us toward the old tunnel. The entrance was partly concealed by ivy and fallen masonry. Clara followed close behind us, while Lestrade kept his lantern raised. "This tunnel has not been used in years," he said. Holmes examined the ground. "Someone has used it recently." There were footprints in the mud. One belonged to a heavy boot. Another was narrow and sharply defined. Clara stared at them. "Those are mine." Holmes shook his head. "No, your shoes have a straight heel. These have a worn outer edge." "Then whose are they?" "We shall see." The tunnel descended gradually into darkness. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the sound of our footsteps echoed strangely along the stone walls. After perhaps 200 yards, Holmes stopped beside a recess. There was a fresh candle burning upon the ground. Next to it lay a small wooden box. Holmes opened it. Inside was a collection of letters, each bearing the same symbol, the circle crossed by 3 lines. He read the first letter, then the second. His expression became increasingly grave. "What is it?" I asked. "Evidence that Sir Reginald was not the master of this conspiracy." "Then who was?" "Someone above him." He handed me one of the letters. It contained only a list of names and dates. Several names were familiar from newspapers and Parliament, though Holmes immediately took it back. "You should not read further." "Why?" "Because if these documents are genuine, they could cause a scandal of national proportions." Lestrade stared at him. Then we have stumbled upon something much larger than murder. We have stumbled upon the reason for the murder. A noise echoed from farther down the tunnel. We extinguished our lamps. Someone was approaching. Holmes motioned for us to remain silent. The footsteps came closer. A figure appeared at the far end of the passage, carrying a lantern. He was tall and wore a dark coat. Clara suddenly gripped my arm. "Adrian!" The figure stopped. For several seconds no one moved. Then the man raised the lantern, revealing a pale, narrow face. Eleanor gasped, "I know you." The man looked directly at her. "You should." Holmes stepped forward. "Adrian Wexford." The stranger smiled bitterly. "That is the name I used before my father tried to have me killed." Lestrade drew his revolver. "You are under suspicion for the murder of Sir Reginald Wexford." Adrian laughed softly. "My father's murder?" He shook his head. "I wanted him alive." Holmes watched him closely. "Then tell us who killed him." Adrian's smile disappeared. "The same man who has been trying to kill me for 18 months. "Who?" "Sir Reginald's solicitor." I looked at Holmes in surprise. "Mr. Harcourt?" Adrian nodded. "He has controlled the estate's finances for years. My father discovered that Harcourt was using the Wexford properties to conceal a network of illegal transactions." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then why did Sir Reginald continue employing him?" "Because Harcourt had something against him." "What?" Adrian hesitated. "Proof that my father had once committed a crime himself." Before Holmes could ask another question, a gunshot exploded through the tunnel. Adrian staggered backward. Clara screamed. Holmes seized the lantern and moved toward him, but Adrian had already fallen into the darkness. Lestrade rushed forward. "He's been shot. We found blood upon the stones, but no body." Holmes knelt and examined the trail. "He was wounded. Then where is he?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes pointed toward a narrow opening in the wall. There, behind a section of loose masonry, was a concealed passage. Holmes entered first. The passage opened into a small underground chamber. Adrian was lying against the wall, clutching his shoulder. Clara rushed toward him. "Adrian!" He pushed her away. "You should not have come." Holmes examined the wound. "The bullet passed through. You will survive." Adrian looked at him. "You must leave." "Why?" "Because Harcourt is not the man you should fear." Holmes became very still. "Who then?" Adrian reached into his coat and removed a folded document. "My father wrote this the night before he died." Holmes opened it. I watched his face as he read. The color slowly drained from it. "Watson," he said, "there is something here I did not expect." "What?" Holmes looked at Eleanor. "Your father believed the murderer was a member of his own family." Eleanor stared at him. "That is impossible." Holmes turned the paper over. On the reverse was a single sentence written in Sir Reginald's hand. "If I die, trust neither of my children." A sudden sound came from the tunnel behind us. Footsteps. Then another shot. Holmes extinguished the lantern. In the darkness, a voice whispered, "One of them has already betrayed you." When the lamp was relit, Adrian had vanished. Only a single blood-stained button remained upon the stone floor. Holmes picked it up and examined it beneath the flame. The same circle crossed by 3 lines was engraved upon it. He looked at me with an expression I had rarely seen upon his face. "Watson," he said, "we have been assuming that this symbol belongs to an organization, and it does not." Holmes closed his hand around the button. "No, it belongs to a person." He glanced toward the tunnel. "And I believe that person has been following us since Baker Street." For several minutes after Adrian Wexford disappeared, we remained in the underground chamber without speaking. The silence was broken only by the slow dripping of water from the ceiling and the distant rumble of a train passing somewhere beyond the tunnel walls. Lestrade was furious. He had searched the chamber twice, examined the narrow passage through which Adrian had vanished, and even ordered the constables to surround the tunnel entrance, yet every effort had produced nothing. Holmes, meanwhile, appeared almost indifferent to the disappearance. He stood beneath the weak light of the lantern, turning the blood-stained button between his fingers. "You seem remarkably calm," I observed. "Calm, Watson? I am delighted." "Delighted?" Lestrade exclaimed. "A suspected murderer has escaped after being shot, and you are delighted? Adrian Wexford is not our murderer." "How can you possibly know that?" "Because the man who shot him wanted us to believe precisely that he was." Lestrade frowned. "You are saying the shooting was staged?" "No. The bullet was real. The blood was real, and Adrian was genuinely wounded, but his disappearance was intentional. By whom? Holmes looked toward the passage. By Adrian himself. We returned to the surface shortly before dawn. The eastern sky had begun to pale, and a thin rain was falling over Ashcombe Station. Clara stood beneath the shelter of the old platform, staring at the dark mouth of the tunnel. Eleanor had said almost nothing since learning that she had a brother. She seemed lost between grief, anger, and disbelief. I approached her and attempted some words of reassurance, but before I could speak, Holmes joined us. "Miss Wexford," he said, "I must ask you something which may be unpleasant." She looked at him. "Ask." "When you first saw Adrian tonight, what did you feel?" "Fear. Only fear." Eleanor hesitated. "No, what else?" "Recognition." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Recognition is an interesting word. I cannot explain it. When I looked at him, I felt that I had known him all my life. And yet you have no memory of him." "No. Perhaps you have more memory than you think." She shook her head. "I remember my childhood." Holmes said nothing for several moments. Then he asked, "Do you remember the fire?" Eleanor's face suddenly went white. Clara turned sharply toward her. "What fire?" "There was a fire at the old house," Holmes continued. "You were 7 years old. Your father told everyone that you had been asleep upstairs." Eleanor pressed a hand against her forehead. "I remember smoke." "Anything else?" "A bell." Holmes looked at me. "There it is." Eleanor closed her eyes. "Someone was calling my name." "Who?" "A boy." Clara stepped closer. "Adrian?" Eleanor opened her eyes. "I don't know." "What did he say?" "He told me to run." Her breathing became faster. "Then I remember my father's voice. He was shouting. There was a door. Someone locked it." Holmes caught her arm before she could fall. "Enough." She steadied herself. "Why did you ask me that?" "Because memory is sometimes more reliable when it is frightened." Clara looked at Holmes with suspicion. "You believe my father erased her memory. I believe he concealed something from both of you." Holmes then turned toward Lestrade. "We must return to Wexford Hall." "Why?" "Because the murderer has been there." "You think he will return?" "He already has." Lestrade stared at him. "What makes you say that?" Holmes held up the brass button. "This was found in the tunnel, but the mud upon it is not from the tunnel." He scraped its edge with his knife. "It contains a mixture of chalk, peat, and crushed limestone." "So?" "The same mixture exists beneath the floor of the old crypt at Wexford Hall." Lestrade looked surprised. "There is a crypt?" "According to the estate plans." Holmes smiled faintly. "Our enemy has been considerably less mysterious than he believes. By the time we reached the hall, the rain had intensified. The house appeared even more sinister than before, its upper windows dark, and its long corridors filled with shadows. Bell met us at the entrance. He looked exhausted. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I have done as you instructed." "You searched the servants' quarters?" "Yes." "Anything unusual?" "One of the rooms had been entered." "Whose?" "Mr. Harcourt's." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "The solicitor's?" "Yes." "Where is he?" "He left shortly after midnight." "Where did he say he was going?" "To London." Holmes smiled. "Of course." We hurried upstairs. Harcourt's room had been searched with considerable thoroughness. Papers were scattered across the desk, drawers stood open, and a small traveling case had been removed from the wardrobe. Holmes examined the room silently. He then approached the fireplace. "Interesting. What is it?" I asked. "Someone searched for a document." "How do you know?" He pointed to the desk. "The drawers contain personal correspondence, yet the intruder ignored them." "The fireplace contains ashes from recently burned papers." Holmes stirred them with the poker, but not all of the document was destroyed. He lifted a charred fragment with his forceps. Several words remained visible: transfer of property, Blackwater, signature of... The rest was gone. Holmes placed it carefully into an envelope. Harcourt was searching for evidence against himself. Lestrade looked satisfied. "Then we have our man." "No." "Again?" "Harcourt has motive, opportunity, and access, but he is too obvious." "He has been lying. So have half the people we have questioned." Holmes walked toward the window. A murderer who has spent 18 months concealing his activities would not suddenly leave evidence pointing directly toward himself, unless he panicked. "Our murderer does not panic." Holmes turned. "That is the most important fact we have learned." We descended into the crypt beneath the hall shortly afterward. The entrance was concealed behind a stone panel in the oldest part of the building. Bell unlocked it with the second brass key. The passage beyond was narrow and damp, leading downward beneath the foundations. At the bottom stood several stone chambers containing the graves of the Wexford family. Holmes examined each one until he reached an old tomb marked with a name that had been almost erased by time. "Adrian Wexford," Eleanor whispered. She stepped toward it. "This is his grave?" Clara asked. Bell nodded. Holmes removed the cover from the tomb. The coffin within was old but surprisingly well preserved. Lestrade looked at Holmes. "You said the grave was empty." "Clara said it was empty." Holmes opened the coffin. It was empty. Eleanor gave a frightened cry. "Then where was the body?" Holmes examined the interior carefully. "There was never a body here." Clara stared at him. "But my father told me Adrian was dead." "Exactly." Holmes stood and examined the stone around the tomb. "The coffin was placed here as a deception." "Why?" I asked. Holmes pointed to the wall behind it. "Because the real secret was not the grave." He pressed a stone. It moved inward. Behind it was a narrow chamber containing shelves of documents, ledgers, and sealed envelopes. At the center stood a small iron box. Holmes opened it. Inside was a collection of letters bound together by black ribbon. The first was addressed to Sir Reginald, the second to Thomas Bell. The third bore no name. Holmes opened it. His expression changed immediately. "What is it?" I asked. He handed me the letter. It contained only a few lines. "Reginald, if you have reached this chamber, then you have discovered what I feared. The boy was never dead. He was taken from us because he witnessed the exchange at Ashcombe. Do not trust Harcourt. Do not trust Vane. Most of all, do not trust the woman who wears Eleanor's face." I looked up. "The woman who wears Eleanor's face?" Holmes took the letter back. "Yes." Clara stepped forward. "What does it mean?" Holmes did not answer. Eleanor stared at her sister. "Clara?" Clara looked genuinely horrified. "I don't understand." Holmes moved between the two women. "Neither do I. Yet the writer knew something that we have overlooked." "What?" Lestrade asked. Holmes pointed to the letter. "The phrase is not 'do not trust Eleanor.' It is 'do not trust the woman who wears Eleanor's face.'" He looked carefully at Clara. "That distinction matters." Before anyone could respond, a loud crash came from above. Bell rushed toward the stairs. Then we heard a woman scream. Eleanor ran after him. Holmes seized my arm. "Watson, stay here." We followed him nonetheless. The scream had come from the library. When we entered, we found Eleanor standing beside the desk, staring at the window. Clara was gone. The window was open. On the carpet lay a single envelope. Holmes picked it up. Inside was a photograph. It showed two little girls standing beside a man who was unmistakably Sir Reginald. The girls looked almost identical, but beneath one girl's image someone had written, "Eleanor." Beneath the other, "Clara." Holmes turned the photograph over. There was another sentence. "The mistake was made 21 years ago." Eleanor stared at it. "What mistake?" Holmes looked toward the open window. The wrong child was raised as Eleanor. The room seemed to spin around me. "But that is impossible," I said. Holmes shook his head. "Not impossible, Watson, merely inconvenient." He examined the photograph again. "Your father may not have been protecting Eleanor from the world. Then whom was he protecting?" Holmes's eyes moved toward the darkness beyond the window. "Clara." A sound came from the corridor. Footsteps. We turned. Thomas Bell stood in the doorway, holding a revolver. His face was filled with terror. "Mr. Holmes," he whispered, "you must leave this house immediately." "Why?" Bell looked toward Eleanor. "Because she is not who you think she is." Holmes's expression became cold. "Then tell me who she is." Bell raised the revolver. "I cannot." "Why?" "Because Sir Reginald is still alive." The words struck us like a physical blow. Eleanor gasped. Lestrade stepped forward. "That is impossible." Bell shook his head. "No." He lowered the revolver. "The man found dead on Blackwater Moor was not Sir Reginald Wexford." Holmes stared at him. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Watson," he said, "the entire case has just changed." Bell looked toward the window. "And if you want to find the real Sir Reginald, you must go to the place where the first murder was planned." "Where?" Bell swallowed. "The old chapel." At that instant, the lights in the hall went out. A gunshot thundered through the darkness. When Lestrade struck a match, Bell was lying on the floor. The revolver was gone, and upon the wall behind him, written in fresh blood, were 5 words. The Moor remembers everything. For several seconds after the lights returned, none of us moved. The words upon the wall seemed to possess a terrible finality. The Moor remembers everything. Beneath them, Thomas Bell lay upon the carpet, one hand pressed against his shoulder where the bullet had struck him. Lestrade knelt beside him and examined the wound. "He is alive," he said. "The bullet passed through the flesh." Holmes was already examining the floor. "The revolver was fired from the doorway," he said. "The shooter stood approximately 6 feet away. Can you identify him?" Lestrade demanded. "Not yet." Holmes moved toward the open library door and studied the corridor. "But he was not alone." "How do you know?" I asked. "There are 2 sets of footprints." He pointed toward the carpet. "One belongs to the shooter. The other belongs to someone who stood behind him." Lestrade frowned. "A second accomplice? Possibly." Holmes looked toward Eleanor. "Miss Wexford, where is Clara?" Eleanor's face was pale. "I don't know. When did you last see her?" "A few minutes ago. Did she leave through the window?" "I think so." Holmes crossed the room and examined the sill. "No, she did not. But the window is open." "Yes, which is precisely why it was opened." He pointed toward the muddy ground outside. "There are no footprints beneath it." "Then someone opened it from inside." "Correct." Lestrade stared at him. "So Clara did not escape through the window?" "No." Holmes looked toward the corridor. "She was taken." We searched the hall from cellar to attic, but Clara had vanished. There was no sign of forced entry, no blood, and no trace of a struggle. Holmes appeared increasingly troubled. At last he returned to the library and stood before the message written on the wall. "Watson," he said, "what do you make of it?" "It suggests the murderer knows something about Blackwater Moor. More than that." He pointed toward the final word. "Everything." "Meaning?" "The writer wants us to believe the moor is the location of the secret, but the wording implies memory." "You think it is a clue?" "I think it is an instruction." He turned toward Lestrade. "How far is the old chapel from the place where Sir Reginald's body was found?" "Perhaps half a mile. And the old burial ground? Another quarter-mile beyond it." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "There is our destination." Before we left, Holmes examined Bell's wound and questioned him while he remained conscious. "Who shot you?" Bell shook his head. "I did not see his face." "How many men entered the library?" "1. "You are certain?" "Yes." Holmes looked at me. "Then our second set of footprints belonged to someone who was already in the room." Bell suddenly gripped Holmes's sleeve. "Miss Eleanor, what about her? She must not go to the chapel." Eleanor stepped forward. "Why?" Bell's eyes filled with fear. "Because that is where your father kept the other one." Holmes leaned closer. "The other what?" Bell whispered. "The other body." The journey across Blackwater Moor was made under a sky heavy with clouds. The rain had stopped, but the ground remained soaked and treacherous. Holmes moved quickly, carrying his lantern low. Eleanor followed beside me, silent and pale. Lestrade had brought 4 constables and 2 lamps. We reached the area where Sir Reginald's body had been discovered. Holmes stopped beneath the elm tree. "Here." He crouched and examined the earth. "The ground has been disturbed since our last visit." I saw several fresh marks around the tree roots. Holmes removed his pocket knife and began scraping away the wet soil. After several minutes, his blade struck something hard. He cleared the mud and revealed a narrow iron ring. "A trapdoor," Lestrade exclaimed. Holmes pulled it upward. Beneath it was a shaft descending into darkness. Cold air rose from below. "How long has this been here?" I asked. "Long enough for the earth to settle around it," Holmes replied, "but not long enough to conceal recent use." We descended carefully. The passage beneath the moor was supported by ancient stone arches, suggesting that it had been constructed decades earlier. Water trickled along one side, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. After perhaps 50 yards, the tunnel divided. Holmes examined both directions. "The left passage leads toward the chapel." "And the right?" Lestrade asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Toward the old house." "Which way?" "Both." We chose the right-hand passage. The tunnel narrowed until we were forced to walk single file. After several minutes, we heard voices ahead. Holmes extinguished his lantern and motioned for us to do the same. We advanced in darkness until a faint light appeared. A chamber opened before us. 2 men stood beside a wooden table. One was Samuel Vane. The other was the tall man in the grey hat whom we had seen at Ashcombe Station. Between them lay a large black box. Lestrade immediately raised his revolver. "Samuel Vane, you are under arrest." Vane laughed. "Inspector, if you arrest me now, you will lose the only man who can explain what happened to Sir Reginald." Holmes stepped forward. "Where is he?" Vane looked at him. "Closer than you imagine. The body on the moor was not his." "No. Then whose was it?" Vane's expression became grim. "A man named Arthur Bellamy." I stared at him. Who was Bellamy? A former associate of Sir Reginald. Why was he killed? Because he resembled him. Holmes's eyes narrowed. A substitute. Exactly. Lestrade looked furious. "Then why did you not tell us this?" Vane laughed bitterly. "Because every time I tried, someone attempted to kill me." Holmes approached the black box. "Where did you get this?" "From Harcourt." "You stole it." "No, he gave it to me." Holmes's expression changed. "Why?" "Because he knew the game was over." The man in the grey hat suddenly stepped forward. Holmes raised his revolver. "Remove your hat." The stranger obeyed. I recognized him immediately. It was Edward Harcourt. Lestrade swore. "You?" Harcourt smiled coldly. "I suspected you would eventually arrive." Holmes studied him. "You have been manipulating us from the beginning." "Not entirely. You arranged the railway signals." "Yes. You planted the false evidence." "Some of it." "You created the trail leading toward Samuel Vane." Harcourt smiled. "Vane was useful because he already had a reputation." Holmes nodded. "But you did not kill Sir Reginald." Harcourt's smile disappeared. "No, you know who did." "Yes." "And you have been protecting that person." "Not protecting." Harcourt glanced toward the black box. "Surviving." Holmes examined the box. "What is inside?" Harcourt shook his head. "Open it." "I cannot." "Why?" "Because it requires 2 keys." Holmes took the brass key from his pocket. "This one?" Harcourt nodded. "And the second?" "With Eleanor." Every eye turned toward her. Eleanor reached slowly into her coat and produced the second brass key. "I found it in my room." Holmes examined both keys. Their teeth were almost identical, but one had a tiny notch near the base. "2-part lock," he said, "Sir Reginald's precaution." He inserted the keys simultaneously. The lock clicked. The lid opened. Inside was not money, nor jewels, nor documents concerning property. It contained photographs, letters, railway tickets, and a small leather notebook. Holmes lifted the notebook. On the first page was written, "The Wexford account." He began reading. His expression changed with every page. "What is it?" I asked. "A record of payments." "To whom?" "Politicians, officials, businessmen." Lestrade stared. "Bribery? And worse." Holmes turned another page. "The dates correspond with the disappearances of several men who were believed to have fled the country." Harcourt spoke quietly. "Sir Reginald discovered the network years ago. At first he participated, then he attempted to withdraw." "And they threatened him?" Holmes asked. "They threatened his children." Eleanor stepped forward. "My father sacrificed Adrian?" Harcourt looked at her. "Your father believed one child had to disappear to save the other." Holmes suddenly closed the notebook. "No." Everyone looked at him. "That is not what happened." "What do you mean?" Lestrade asked. Holmes turned toward Eleanor. "Your father did not sacrifice Adrian." He pointed toward the photograph. "He concealed him." "Why?" "Because Adrian witnessed the murder of Arthur Bellamy." Vane nodded slowly. "Yes." Holmes continued. "Bellamy was not merely a substitute. He was the man who discovered that Sir Reginald intended to expose the network." "Then who killed Bellamy?" I asked. Holmes looked at Harcourt. "You?" Harcourt shook his head. "No." Holmes's eyes moved toward Vane. "You?" "No." Then Holmes became very still. A faint sound came from the passage behind us. Footsteps. Everyone turned. A woman appeared at the entrance. Clara. Her dress was torn, and there was blood upon one sleeve, but she was alive. Behind her stood an elderly man. Eleanor gave a strangled cry. "Father?" Sir Reginald Wexford stepped into the chamber. He looked older than the portrait I had seen in the hall. his face pale and his hair almost entirely white. Yet there was no mistaking him. Lestrade's revolver rose immediately. "Sir Reginald Wexford, you are under arrest." Sir Reginald ignored him. He looked directly at Holmes. "You have done very well, Mr. Holmes." Holmes did not move. "You allowed everyone to believe you were dead. Yes, you arranged for Bellamy's body to be placed upon the moor." Sir Reginald lowered his head. "Yes, you allowed your daughter to believe her brother was dead. Yes, you allowed Vane to be arrested. I had no choice." Holmes's eyes hardened. "There is always a choice." Sir Reginald looked toward Eleanor. "I did it to protect her." Eleanor stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "You destroyed my life. I saved it." "No. You lied to me." Sir Reginald closed his eyes. "I know." Holmes turned toward Clara. "And you?" he asked. Clara looked at her father. "I was supposed to remain hidden, yet you came back. I wanted the truth." Holmes nodded. "And Adrian?" Everyone became silent. Sir Reginald looked toward the passage. "He is alive." "Where?" "Safe." Holmes studied him carefully. "Then why did Adrian claim you tried to have him killed?" Sir Reginald's expression changed. "Because he believed it." "Did you?" "No." "Then who did?" Sir Reginald looked at the black box. "The man who has been controlling all of us." Holmes waited. Sir Reginald whispered a name. "Thomas Bell." I stared at him. "The butler?" Sir Reginald nodded. "He has served me for 26 years. "But he was shot," I protested. Holmes suddenly looked toward the entrance. "Watson." I turned. The chamber was empty. Harcourt was gone. Vane was gone. And the passage behind us stood open. Holmes walked to the doorway and examined the floor. There were fresh footprints. 2 sets. One belonged to Harcourt. The other belonged to Bell. Holmes's expression became grim. "Sir Reginald," he said, "where is Thomas Bell?" The old man's face went white. "I thought he was with you." Holmes looked at me. "Watson, the game has entered its final stage." He picked up the lantern. "We have been chasing the conspirators." He pointed toward the dark passage. "Now they are running from us." Suddenly a distant explosion shook the underground chamber. Dust fell from the ceiling. Lestrade shouted, "The tunnel!" Holmes seized my arm. "Quickly!" We ran toward the passage. Behind us, Sir Reginald cried out. When we turned, the chamber was filling with smoke. Clara was gone. And upon the black box, which had been open only moments before, someone had placed a final note. Holmes picked it up. There were only 6 words. "Ask who Eleanor really is." Holmes stared at the message for several seconds. Then he looked at Eleanor. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. "Watson," he said quietly, "there is one question we have neglected from the beginning." "What question?" "Who was the little girl that Sir Reginald brought home 21 years ago?" Eleanor stared at him. "I was." Holmes shook his head. "No." He turned toward the burning passage. "I no longer believe you were." The words of Holmes had scarcely left his lips when the tunnel behind us gave another violent tremor. A shower of dust descended from the ceiling, and somewhere in the darkness a heavy beam collapsed with a thunderous crash. Lestrade seized Eleanor by the arm and pulled her away from the passage, while I assisted Sir Reginald toward the chamber wall. Holmes, however, appeared utterly unmoved by the danger. He stood with the blood-stained note in his hand, his eyes fixed upon Eleanor with such extraordinary concentration that I felt a chill run through me. "Holmes," I said, "surely you do not mean that this woman is an impostor?" "I mean nothing of the kind, Watson." He folded the note and placed it inside his coat. "But the evidence requires us to reconsider what we have assumed." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. "You think I am not myself? I think you are Eleanor Wexford in every respect that matters. The question is whether you were born Eleanor Wexford." Clara stepped forward. "She was." Holmes turned to her. "You are certain?" "I know my sister. You know the girl who was raised beside you." Clara's face hardened. "What difference is there?" 21 years of deception," Holmes replied. Sir Reginald suddenly spoke. "Enough." His voice was weak, but it carried authority. "She is my daughter." Holmes looked at him. "Then prove it." The old man's face tightened. "How?" "Tell me something only the real Eleanor could know." Sir Reginald looked toward the young woman. For several seconds father and daughter stared at one another. "When you were 5, he said at last, "you broke your mother's porcelain horse." Eleanor's expression changed. "You blamed Adrian." "Yes." But he did not do it. Sir Reginald nodded. You told me that you had broken it because Adrian had frightened you. Eleanor looked confused. I remember. Holmes immediately turned to me. Watson, did you notice that? Notice what? She remembered an event she claimed earlier to have forgotten. Eleanor touched her forehead. I don't understand. Holmes softened slightly. Neither do I, yet we are getting closer. We returned to the hall before dawn. The underground passage had become unsafe, and Lestrade ordered several constables to search the grounds for Bell and Harcourt. Sir Reginald was taken to the library, where he sat beneath the portrait of his late wife. Eleanor remained standing near the window, while Clara watched her from the opposite side of the room. I confess that the entire household seemed transformed. Every object had become suspicious. Every family resemblance appeared to conceal some darker secret. Holmes stood beside the fireplace, smoking his pipe and examining the photograph of the two little girls. Holmes, I said, what exactly are you looking for? The difference between the girls? No, between the photograph and memory. He placed the photograph upon the table. Look at their hands. I examined the image. The girl on the left wears a small bracelet. Yes, the other does not. And look at the hair. They are dressed alike. Not quite. Holmes pointed to the collars of their dresses. One has 3 buttons, the other has 2. Does that matter? Not ordinarily, but the photograph was taken after the fire, when the children were supposedly separated. Then why were they dressed alike? Because someone wanted them to appear interchangeable. Holmes turned to Sir Reginald. Where was this photograph taken? At the old house. Who took it? Sir Reginald remained silent. Holmes nodded. That is what I expected. The door opened, and Inspector Lestrade entered. We found nothing. Bell? Gone. Harcourt? Gone. Clara? Here. Vane? Lestrade hesitated. Gone as well. Holmes smiled faintly. Of course. Lestrade stared at him. You are enjoying this. Not at all. You look as though you know where they have gone. I do? Lestrade's expression sharpened. Where? The old house. Sir Reginald looked up sharply. No. Holmes turned toward him. That reaction confirms it. You cannot go there. Why? Because the house was destroyed. Not entirely. Sir Reginald rose unsteadily. Holmes, you do not understand. Then explain. The old man looked toward Eleanor. The old house contains the truth about what happened 21 years ago. Holmes stepped closer. What happened? Sir Reginald's voice dropped. There was no fire. Silence filled the room. Clara stared at him. What? The smoke was manufactured. Eleanor whispered. Why? Sir Reginald closed his eyes. Because someone wanted the world to believe that one of my children had died. Holmes' eyes flashed. Which child? Sir Reginald did not answer. Eleanor stepped toward him. Father. He looked at her. You were never supposed to know. Know what? That Adrian was not the child who disappeared. Clara's face became white. Then who? Sir Reginald looked directly at Eleanor. You. Eleanor staggered backward. Holmes remained silent. You were taken from the house that night, Sir Reginald continued. Someone removed you while the supposed fire was being staged. Adrian remained behind. Where was I taken? To the Wexford estate. But I grew up here. Yes. Eleanor stared at him. Then what are you saying? Sir Reginald's voice broke. I am saying that the child returned to this house after the fire was not the same child who had lived here before it. I felt a profound confusion. Then who was she? Sir Reginald looked toward Clara. Clara was the child who remained. Clara recoiled. No. Yes. Then why did I believe I was Clara? Sir Reginald lowered his head. Because that was what you were told. Holmes suddenly stepped forward. Stop. Everyone turned toward him. He looked at Sir Reginald with an expression of cold suspicion. You have made a fundamental error. What? You are telling us a story. Sir Reginald stared at him. It is the truth. Perhaps, but truth and accuracy are not always the same thing. Holmes picked up the photograph. You say the children were separated. Yet this photograph shows both of them together after the supposed disappearance. It was taken before the fire. Then why is the date written upon the back? Sir Reginald went silent. Holmes turned the photograph over. The date is 3 days after the fire. Lestrade stepped forward. Then someone forged the date. Exactly. Holmes smiled. And that means the photograph was planted. At that moment there came a knock at the library door. A constable entered, carrying a small wooden box. Inspector, this was found beneath the eastern staircase. Holmes immediately took it. It was blackened by smoke. Upon its lid was the familiar symbol of the circle crossed by 3 lines. Another box, I said. Holmes opened it. Inside was a child's silver bracelet. Eleanor stared at it. I know that. Holmes lifted it carefully. Where? I wore it when I was young. Clara shook her head. No, I wore it. Eleanor looked at her. You. Clara touched the bracelet. I remember it. Holmes examined the clasp. On the underside was engraved a tiny letter. E. Eleanor, I said. Holmes shook his head. Or Evelyn. Who is Evelyn? Lestrade asked. Sir Reginald suddenly sat down. His face had become almost corpse-like. My wife's name was Evelyn. Holmes turned to him. Then this bracelet belonged to your wife. No, Sir Reginald whispered. It belonged to the child she lost. Holmes's eyes narrowed. You had another child? Sir Reginald did not answer. Clara began to tremble. Father? At last he spoke. Before Eleanor and Adrian, your mother gave birth to a daughter. The revelation stunned us all. Her name was Evelyn. Holmes looked toward the 2 women. And what happened to her? She died at birth. Where is the record? Sir Reginald looked away. There is none. Holmes smiled grimly. Then she may never have existed. Lestrade suddenly interrupted. Holmes, this is becoming absurd. We have a dead man who may not be Sir Reginald, a living Sir Reginald who allowed himself to be declared dead, 2 daughters who may not know their identities, a missing son, and a servant who has vanished. We need something solid. Holmes looked at him. Agreed. He turned toward the door. Bring me the family physician. Within half an hour, Dr. James Merritt arrived at Wexford Hall. He was an elderly man with silver hair and a nervous manner. Holmes questioned him about the children born to Sir Reginald and Evelyn Wexford. The doctor initially insisted that there had been only 3, Clara, Eleanor, and Adrian. But when Holmes produced the bracelet, the man's composure disappeared. You remember, Holmes said. Merritt looked at Sir Reginald. I was sworn to secrecy. By whom? Sir Reginald. Why? The doctor lowered his head. Because the child was not dead. Everyone stared at him. The infant survived, he continued, but she was born with a distinctive mark upon her shoulder. Holmes turned toward Eleanor. Miss Wexford, have you such a mark? Eleanor hesitated. Yes. Where? Behind my left shoulder. Holmes looked at Clara. And you? Clara shook her head. I have none. Holmes's face became thoughtful. Then we have our first genuine piece of physical evidence. Sir Reginald suddenly stood. No. Holmes turned. No. You cannot do this. Do what? Separate my daughters. Holmes stepped toward him. I am not separating anyone. I am identifying them. The old man's voice broke. You don't understand. The mark was given to the child after the fire. Holmes froze. What did you say? Sir Reginald closed his eyes. The mark was not a birthmark. The room became silent. Holmes's expression changed. Then how was it made? Sir Reginald whispered, with a heated piece of metal. I felt a wave of horror. Why? Sir Reginald looked toward Eleanor. To identify her. Holmes's eyes narrowed. By whom? Sir Reginald did not answer. The library door suddenly burst open. A constable stumbled inside. Inspector, Lestrade turned. What is it? We found someone near the old house. Who? The constable swallowed. Mr. Harcourt. Holmes moved toward him. Alive? No, sir. Dead. The constable shook his head. He is alive. Holmes stopped. Then what is the problem? The constable's face had gone white. He is asking for you. Where is he? At the old house. Holmes took his hat. Then we shall go. Lestrade followed. Before I could leave, Eleanor caught my arm. Dr. Watson. I turned. She was trembling. I remember something. What? The night of the fire. What do you remember? She looked toward the window. There was a man. Who? I could not see his face. What did he do? He carried a child. My heart quickened. Which child? Eleanor stared at me. Me. I was about to ask another question when Holmes called from the corridor. "Watson!" I hurried after him. As we crossed the hall, I glanced once more toward Eleanor. She was still standing in the library, watching us. And for one fleeting moment, I saw an expression upon her face that I had never witnessed before. It was not fear, it was recognition. Outside, the carriage waited. Holmes climbed aboard. "Watson," he said, "we have spent the entire investigation asking who killed Sir Reginald. And now? Now we must ask something more important." "What?" He looked toward the distant silhouette of the old house. "Who was the child that the murderer carried away?" The carriage began to move. Behind us, Wexford Hall disappeared into the mist. Ahead lay the ruined house, where the mystery had begun 21 years earlier. And somewhere within its walls waited Edward Harcourt, wounded but alive, while another man, perhaps Thomas Bell, perhaps someone still unknown, held the final secret of the Wexford family. As we approached the old house, Holmes suddenly leaned forward. "Stop the carriage!" The driver pulled the reins. Holmes stepped down. "What is it?" I asked. He pointed toward the mud beside the road. There was a fresh footprint, a narrow woman's shoe. Beside it was another impression, a child's shoe. Holmes examined them carefully. "Watson," he said softly, "these footprints were made within the last hour." He looked toward the ruined house, "and the child has come back."